The following program is a presentation of Grace Communion International and Grace Communion Seminary and is made possible by generous donations from viewers like you. On this episode of You're Included, Professor Stephen Seamands illuminates how God is actively involved in redeeming our pain and heartbreak. Our host is Michael Morrison.
Steve, you've written a book, Wounds That Heal. Now, as you describe it, this book is designed more for ordinary Christians, but everybody's been wounded in some way or another, and that this book can touch them and is written in a way for them. Maybe you could start by talking about the title, Wounds That Heal. I mean, you're saying that my wound is eventually going to heal?
Yeah, the possibility is there. And I think, Mike, it's real important to emphasize the subtitle of that book, which is Bringing Our Hurts to the Cross, because I wanted to show how the cross answers the need for human sufferers and wounds to be healed, as well as a place where human sinners can come to get their sins forgiven. Because oftentimes when we talk about the cross of Christ, we focused a lot on how it addresses the problem of human sin. And that is, of course, the primary New Testament keynote. Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures. But we're not just sinners, we're sufferers.
That people have sinned against us.
And yes, we have sinned, but we've also been sinned against. And the cross actually addresses both needs. And so what I was trying to show was how the cross profoundly speaks to us as sufferers as well as sinners. Because I think even though we're both, the sufferer and the sinner have a little different need, so that's what I was trying to focus on, and to suggest that there is healing power in the cross of Christ for our wounds, as it were. And of course, that's right out of Isaiah 53. By His stripes we are healed, by His wounds we are healed.
That His wounds help heal our wounds.
Right.
But how do we bring, as the subtitle says, bring our hurts? How do we, obviously our hurts aren't a thing we can pick up to bring there. But as there's a metaphor, how do we do this?
It's real important, first of all, for us to own the hurt and the pain and to recognize, yes, I've been hurt. I've been sinned against. And sometimes it's hard for people to do that. Sometimes we want to let someone else off the hook, you might say.
We say, oh, it was nothing.
Or it was nothing, or they didn't really mean that. Or maybe I deserved that. And so consequently, sometimes it takes a while for a person to admit, I've been sinned against, I've been hurt. And so it's important, that's a really, might say a preliminary step. Then I think it's really important in bringing our hurts to the cross to begin to think about the cross in terms of how Jesus Himself was hurt, you might say, how Jesus Himself suffered on the cross, the different ways in which He suffered. For example, maybe I've experienced a lot of shame in my life. Maybe somebody shamed me or said things to me that put me down, and I experienced a lot of shame. Well, to understand that Jesus was shamed. In fact, on the cross, we tend to think of the excruciating physical pain that He went through, but in the ancient world, it was the shame of crucifixion that was actually the thing that was most dreaded.
Because this flogging and wasn't private.
Exactly, it's done publicly out there, and this person's put out, hung up there, you might say, and their family and their village, their town, all of those would be implicated in that. So it was a way to shame that person, and oftentimes they actually left the person up there after they died. And the wild animals would come and pick the flesh off their bones. It was awful, And to know that Jesus, the writer of the book of Hebrews says, for the joy that was set before Him, He endured the cross, despising the shame.
Right.
So to know and to think about Jesus, he was lonely. He was betrayed. He was forsaken. He even felt God forsaken. All the ways in which he suffered. I think it helps as you think about your hurts, put them in the context of his hurt.
He's been there.
He's been there.
He's felt that.
He's felt that. He's experienced that, so that that helps us to reframe our suffering and our anguish in the light of his. And then, so I think that's maybe a second step is to look at him, stand before him and look at him, see what he suffered. And then oftentimes there are things that, to bring our hurts to the cross, Jesus on the cross forgives. And he says, Father, forgive them. I think that's a kind of a model, and I would say that probably the greatest barrier that keeps people from receiving healing from God is unforgiveness. And so so we too are going to probably need to say that to someone. I forgive you, for what you did to me.
And that's the hardest thing to do.
Exactly. In order to let him, I like to explain it like this. In order to let Jesus touch his wounds to your wounds, sometimes we've got to be willing to forgive that person, or give Jesus permission to begin that process of forgiving. Lord Jesus, I don't think I'm willing to forgive them. I'm hurt so much, but I give you permission to begin to do that work in me.
I like what you said as a process.
Yes,
something that we recognize the need for it, but it just doesn't happen right away.
Forgiveness starts with our will primarily. You make a choice to, and sometimes you only have about 20% of your will, but you say, Jesus, take my 20% and add your will to mine, and increase. And so there's that process. And we're little by little. I think that's a key element. I also think sometimes we've got to ask ourselves, have I kind of put a wall around myself? I got hurt, and I decided, never again. And so I'm using a wall to protect myself, and so sometimes in order to experience his wounds touching your wounds, you've got to give Jesus the permission to tear down that wall, to dismantle that wall. That's become your shield.
And then it feels risky.
Yeah, and that feels risky to let that down. Sometimes people have lived with a wound so long that it's become cozy. And you have to, I think, that their victimhood, has become their identity. Mm-hmm. It's become comfortable. They don't know what they would do without it, even though it's destructive and painful.
Part of their life.
Yes. And so those are all questions that, as I work with people and helping them bring their hurts to the cross, I have to kind of help them work through. We're sort of trying to get rid of the things that are keeping Jesus from touching his wounds to their wounds, and then to invite him to do that.
But sometimes when people do sin against us and we are hurt, we still need to have some kind of boundary.
Right.
But it's not as distinct from a wall.
Definitely.
But there's still a boundary there.
Definitely. There are healthy boundaries are important in all human relationships. And sometimes after we've been hurt, especially when we're near it, we need a time when we pull away. Like a dog, that's gotten hurt in a fight, you retreat and lick your wounds for a while. There's a legitimate time and a place for that. And I think that sometimes in ministry, I'm speaking of myself. I've had this I'll just be a good soldier mentality too often, and I failed to take the time to sort of pull back and realize I've been really hurt, and I need to kind of own that and bring that to the Lord, and not just try to keep going on like nothing happened.
Which some wounded soldiers would try to do.
Exactly. We tend to do that. We don't like to admit that we've been hurt. We don't like to admit that we're weak. Anyway, so there's a legitimate time for good kind of boundary setting, and maybe part of the reason I got hurt in the first place was because I didn't set good boundaries. I've got to learn sometimes to boundary myself from certain kinds of people, certain kinds of situations, and that's a part of, I think, becoming a healthy person.
I think there are some abusive relationships, not just, marriage can be abusive, but some congregational settings
Right.
can also be abusive. But forgiveness doesn't mean perpetuating that.
Right. Certainly not. How does a battered wife forgive? Does that mean that she allows herself, now I've forgiven this person that battered me, do I turn around and let them continue to do that? No, you don't perpetuate that. You forgive for the past, but it may mean standing up to that person and being really firm for the first time in that relationship. Forgiveness doesn't mean you become a perpetual punching bag, or that you don't sometimes, I think, demand that justice be done in a situation. If someone, swindled you out of a lot of money, if maybe you're a business partner, took advantage of your trust and so forth, I don't think that taking that person to court is incompatible with forgiveness. Some people would think, oh, how could you do that? Well, you're not taking them to court to try to get revenge, but you do have a legitimate right to justice. And so you would still need to forgive them for what they did, but it might be appropriate for them, to go to court, to take them to court. Or if someone did something to break the law that hurt one of your children, for example, to see that person, the state, punish that person for that, that's not incompatible with forgiveness,
And in many cases, maybe that is the best thing for that person.
Right.
That they do experience.
You're holding them accountable.
Some justice for
right.
that.
Right. Sometimes I've seen actually people, abusive people, actually use forgiveness kind of as a bludgeon.
Oh, you're supposed to forgive me.
You're supposed to forgive me. I did that to you. You're supposed to forgive me now.
If you are a real Christian.
Yes, that that becomes a form of manipulation and power. And that's where you need a person that stands up and says no. And sometimes a person has a hard time doing that. People that are in abusive relationships, are they've almost, that's become their way of
perhaps years
yes.
in that pattern.
So they may need some help, someone else to come alongside them to help them walk through, standing up to someone.
And so they can take those hurts to the cross and realize that, okay, Jesus has been there. He's been in an abusive situation.
Right.
And then what?
Well, I think I do believe that there is a healing light that flows from his wounded side and his hands, and I think that as we've forgiven, that his healing presence can come into those situations, and so there's that dimension of healing, I think, that happens as we bring our hurts to the cross. He really does touch our wounds with his wounds, and the grief and the sadness and the pain, I think, can get absorbed into his broken body.
That he helps carry some of these burdens.
Yes. And then I think finally, just as his own wounds have become radiant scars, like I like to call them, I believe he can actually begin to take that wound, and when as it begins to be healed, he begins to actually take it and use it for his purposes. That which Satan meant to use to destroy you becomes a channel of God's healing grace to others, so that now he's using you in an area of ministry, for example, that relates to the very pain and the suffering that you went through. He redeems it for his glory.
that somebody who's been through that themselves, just as Jesus has been through it and can help us. If we've been through it, then we can help someone else.
Right, right.
But it's not always the same specific hurt that can be generalized. The feeling of abandonment.
Right, right.
Is kind of a general one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And I think suffering in general does sensitize us to the hurts of others, regardless of what the hurt was. I think that it makes us less judgmental of others. It gives us more compassion in general.
What about when we've had hurts that aren't attributable to anybody in particular? We've got cancer, for example. We've suffered, a hurricane came through and blew down our house, killed our son. We can't blame anybody. Is that harder to deal with?
Sometimes it is, because to forgive someone, there has to be a someone. There needs to be something out there. And sometimes situations like that are the hardest to deal with, partly because it's harder to focus on someone there. Although I would imagine if that had happened, I might have to talk to someone about whether they're mad at God about that. And maybe
That's
they need
someone
to
involved.
Exactly. Maybe they need. It seems strange to say this because we don't think of God as hurting people, but do you need to forgive God? And what I would mean by that is God sometimes allows things to happen to us that we think He should have He should have not allowed to happen, And so we're mad at God about that, and so sometimes the person we have to forgive is God. We have to stop holding anger and bitterness toward God for that. And we've got a clenched fist. You're upset with Him, and you need to bring that to Him, and bring that to the cross as well.
I imagine that is more difficult.
Right. It is interesting though that the cross. The Scripture says that on the cross He endured the hostility of sinners. And I think that Jonathan Edwards preached that great sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, but I think on the cross it was God in the hands of angry sinners. And so that, I think we were there saying, crucify Him, crucify Him, the anger that we felt over things that have happened. There is a sense in which, He's carried that, He understands.
He's been through that too.
And the cross is a safe place where you can bring your anger at God to.
So our anger at Him is nothing new.
Exactly.
He's big enough to handle it.
Right. I think part of the, sometimes God, you think about going from Palm Sunday to Good Friday, and why they turned on Him, didn't they? Because He didn't act like gods were supposed to act. He didn't do what they were wanting Him to do. And we have to kind of, I think, sometimes own that, and I'm mad at you about that.
He was not the kind of hero that we were looking for in our particular circumstance.
Absolutely, right.
But even those wounds, in time, well, for some people they don't heal. Maybe they don't bring them to the cross.
Right.
But when we see how the cross intersects our particular hurt, then it does become transforming and healing for us.
Right.
And as you said, then we are able to better help others who are going through something similar. And in some ways, it's like the title of your book has come around full circle there, that our wounds become wounds that heal others.
Right. Yeah, we become healed helpers. What was the name of that book by Henry Nouwen about
wounded healers?
The wounded healer. We become wounded healers, don't we?
Right, but we are also healed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's the amazing thing about how God works. That He takes evil and He uses it to accomplish purposes that sometimes and suffering, and uses it to bring good out of it, to bring glory out of it, so that Joseph can say, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." that's just you get kind of just stunned and awed at God's ability to work His purposes in spite of and in the midst of. And I think the challenge in our lives is to let God have our sorrows, to not waste them, to see that they can be used for His purposes, even though it's not that we want them to have, or that God caused them to have, but if we'll give them to God, He can redeem them.
But we have to trust Him.
Right. The cross helps us trust Him.
That's
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for discussing that with us.
Thank you.
That's-
You've been watching You're Included, a production of Grace Communion International.